My name is Ben Gardner and welcome to STB Bible Basics. This short and very basic course is an opportunity to discover, explore and grow in your understanding of the Bible. It doesn't matter if you've never read it before, this course is for you. Over these next 4 sessions, we're going to look at the 4 basics of the Bible. Firstly, what is the Bible? Secondly, can it be trusted? Thirdly, where do I begin when I try and engage in the Bible? And finally, how does it apply to my life? During these sessions, we're going to have moments to pause, reflect, and begin to answer some of the simple questions, some of the difficult questions as well, about the Bible. So, let's begin. What is the Bible? Is it just a collection of random books, or is it something more than that? The Bible is still the top-selling book worldwide. It is the most critiqued book and is read every day by millions and millions of people in different languages across the world, and when the church gathers together on Sundays and throughout the week. In some countries, the Bible is deemed as contraband. Amy Ewing, in her book Why Trust the Bible, writes this: smuggling operations exist with the sole aim of getting Bibles secretly across borders and into the hands of those who want to read it. The Bible has been used to justify all kinds of horrific actions throughout history, but it has also been used as a blueprint to establish just societies and has transformed people's lives forever. It's not just a collection of 66 books. It is a story that has transformed lives and has transformed the world, our world. During the Queen's coronation in June 1953, she was presented the Bible with these words: "We present you with this book, the most valuable thing that this world affords." For me, the Bible is the Word of God. It is 100% human, in terms of the fact that it was written by human beings. It was written by the hands of real, living, breathing people. And it is also 100% inspired by God. It is His word revealed to us. Alpha is a fantastic course for those interested in exploring the Christian faith. And it uses this story of St. Paul's Cathedral to help us understand this truth. St. Paul's Cathedral was designed by Christopher Wren. Construction started in 1675 when he was 43 years old. It was completed in 1711 when he was 79. Whilst St. Paul's Cathedral was built by Christopher Wren, he didn't actually lay a single stone. There were many involved in its construction: stonemasons, carpenters, labourers and artists, but Christopher Wren was the inspiration behind it all. For me, the Bible is the primary way in which we can understand who God is, what He has done and what He is going to do, and therefore understand who we are and what we have done. My father is a vicar in the Church of England. I remember him telling me of his first memory of when he started to understand the significance of the Bible, of these 66 books. When my father was a boy, his mother sadly passed away due to cancer. His grandfather, who was an incredible man and a real inspiration to my dad, moved in with the family and shared a bunk bed with my dad. In the early hours of the morning, my dad woke to find his grandfather sitting at his desk, with the lamp on, immersed in these letters, these poems, these writings of the Bible. And according to my dad, his grandfather did not simply read it, but it truly shaped his life, just as it has for my father, and for me and my family. We're now going to pause for 5 minutes for you to think about your first encounter, your first experience of the Bible. And then I would love for you to begin to answer these 2 questions. What does the Bible mean to you? And what questions do you have of the Bible? What is the Bible? So what is the Bible? Before we can really answer that question, we're going to take a whistle-stop tour of the Bible. What's actually in it? And I hope this is helpful and useful for you as you get to grips with reading it and trying to understand it. The Bible is comprised of 66 books. The first part is known as the Old Testament, and the second part is known as the New Testament. So let's start with the Old Testament. At some point in the 3rd century BC, before Christ, 5 important books were crafted. No doubt this was done orally, as people recounted the stories of Moses and the people of Israel, and a scribe, someone who could write in those days, recorded these details. It's worth noting that back then people were incredible at remembering a story word for word. They couldn't necessarily write it, but they could remember it in great detail. And detail, especially for the Jewish people, was important to document. These 5 books were known as, and are continued to be known by the Jews as, the Torah, meaning guide, teachings, or law. These are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, as it was written by Hebrews and in Hebrew. It wasn't written in English originally, but it was written in Hebrew. It later became known as the Pentateuch, when in 300 to 285 BC it was translated into Greek, as more and more non-Hebrew speaking Jews increased in number, and so therefore wanted to engage in these texts. You might know the Torah or Pentateuch as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 important books, thought to have been written by Moses, tell the story of God, who they called Yahweh. And it told the story of his people. It begins with God the Creator, creating everything out of nothing. The first sentence of Genesis sets the scene. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It is clear from the outset that this story is about God. A God who creates. A God who loves his creation. And a God who wants to be in relationship with his creation. With human beings made in his image. With people like you and me. The Pentateuch then goes on to tell the story of how humankind, man and woman, decide to go it alone, to turn away from God and attempt to create a God in their own image, to become gods themselves. But God continues to pursue his people by establishing a covenant, basically an agreement, a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. He establishes a nation called Israel and provides them with their own law, and we know these as the 10 Commandments. But despite God's faithfulness to them, the people of Israel keep letting God down. He keeps rescuing them, but they continue to fall short on their agreements that God will be their only God and they will be his people. The Pentateuch ends with the death of Moses, just before they cross over to what is called the Promised Land, after being rescued by God from captivity, from slavery. Around 285 to 200 BC, the remaining texts of what we know as the Old Testament and what we now know as the Old Testament are completed and included within the Hebrew Bible. To give you a better picture of the Hebrew Bible, I have this brilliant periodic table of the Bible above my desk. Here you can see all the books that make up the Old Testament. There are the historical books, from Joshua to Esther, that continue the story of God and his people after they have crossed the River Jordan. Within these historical documents, we have the incredible story of Israel's request to have a human king, just like all the other nations. Despite God wanting to be their only king, because of his love for them, he provides them a king. And a number of kings who sometimes get it right, but often fail, and fail big time. Next in the blue we have what is sometimes known as the wisdom writings. These contain the poetry of the Hebrew nation. They are important stories and offer wisdom to the next generation. My two favourite wisdom writings has to be Job and the Psalms. Job because it doesn't shy away from the real human suffering and the feeling that God is absent. It's an incredibly moving book, a moving story, and provides us with a deeper understanding of what it means to handle times of suffering. And Psalms, because it's the hymn book of the Bible. And I don't know about you, but I love songs. There are 150 songs, hymns, in the book of Psalms expressing different human emotions. Songs that speak of the glory of God, the wonder of God, the power of God. And songs that express a desperation for God to make himself known in the darkest of times. They're a bit like folk songs that tell the historical stories of God and his creation, God and his people, God's people and their enemies. But it does it through song. As we are speaking about the books of wisdom, a word of wisdom, we have to recognise that these books are books of poetry. And as we know from our school days, this particular genre is difficult to unpack, and so we need to read with caution and seek some guidance from others who have carefully and faithfully studied these books of wisdom. And there's lots of commentaries and other things that you can grab hold of later on as you get to grips with the Bible. So let's return to our periodic table of the Bible. We now enter into the land of the prophets. Isaiah through to Daniel are known as the major prophets. You might think from the title that these are the most important prophets, the kings of the prophets, the bigwigs, the big cheeses. But the term major refers only to their length. The minor prophets from Hosea right through to Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, are much shorter than the first few major prophets, and therefore are grouped together in the Hebrew Bible. So you have the major prophets, but also the minor prophets, and that's due to the length of the number of chapters that are within them. These prophetic writings are a constant reminder to God's people, to Israel, that they must return to their first love, God, Yahweh, and not follow their own desires. And that's what these prophetic books keep on saying again and again. You must return to him and live for him and him alone. I remember doing a short project with a bunch of interns a few years ago back in Woodbridge in Suffolk. The project involved all of them presenting a short presentation on a minor prophet. Not an easy task to engage with. I have to say it was pretty depressing, but through it we were constantly reminded of God's love and faithfulness towards his disobedient people. And that's what the prophets are, a constant reminder of God's love, our disobedience, but God's faithfulness to call us back to him. The Old Testament is an incredible collection of books which are packed full of battles, death, deserts, times of loneliness, times of isolation, kings, judges, captivity, songs, poems, and so much more. To sum it up, it's a story of a God who pursues and pursues his people, despite their constant rejection of him. So there you have it, a whistle-stop tour of the Old Testament. Before we pause to reflect and answer some questions, you might be thinking to yourself, so why is the Old Testament in the Christian Bible? And that's a very good and valid question. Well, first of all, the Christian faith emerged out of the Jewish faith, and the story of Israel is important because it's part of our history. It's part of the Christian story. Secondly, the story of the Old Testament is a story of the promise of Jesus. The New Testament writers constantly refer back to the Hebrew texts to demonstrate, to prove that Jesus is who he says he is, and is the one who God had promised to send to restore and redeem all things. The next time you read a book from the Old Testament, I encourage you to read it through the lens of Jesus. Ask yourself, where is Jesus within this story? It's often not very clear, but sometimes it's very, very obvious. We're going to pause for 5 minutes to answer and to ponder these two questions. What was the one thing that struck you about the Old Testament? And which genre of writing, historical writings, poetry, prophecy, resonates with you, and why? So I hope you enjoyed that first part, looking at the Old Testament, a whistle-stop tour of the Old Testament, and I hope the questions have sparked off some further questions that you might want to delve into over the course of the days and weeks ahead. And so we now come to the New Testament, the second part of the Bible. In order to make this as simple as possible, we're going to return back to that periodic table that helps me, and I hope helps you, to understand the Bible. So the Old Testament ends with the 4 short chapters of Malachi. And then we have around about 400 years of silence before the events of the New Testament. That's a long time to wait for the promises of the Old Testament. I don't think our Amazon Prime culture would cope waiting that long, 400 years. The New Testament begins with 4 accounts of Jesus' birth, life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection. We know these as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And for those that used to go to Sunday school, you might remember these 4 books. It is thought that Mark was the first to be written, and then the others used bits of Mark and possibly another source or two to construct their own account. Each write with a particular style and for a slightly different audience. So let's just go through them very quickly. Matthew, who was a tax collector and then gave up that life to follow Jesus, writes mainly for a Jewish audience to prove that Jesus was the Messiah that the Old Testament had promised. Mark wasn't one of Jesus' disciples, but accompanied Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament on his missionary journeys. He writes like a script from a fast-paced movie, getting to the action incredibly quickly. His audience are Christians in Rome, where this gospel was written. Luke, another close friend of Paul, was a doctor. He has an eye for detail and attempts to write an accurate account of the life of Jesus Christ. And it is so accurate that it is up there in terms of the historical documentation of its time. It was known as an authentic and accurate account of what went on. And then we have John, who has a totally different style. It's harder to read, but it is beautifully written and goes deep, really deep. His main aim is to prove that Jesus is the Son of God, hence why at the beginning his opening lines remind us very much of the opening to Genesis. It says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." These 4 gospel accounts contain similar stories, but from a different angle, and with a different audience in mind. But all of them long for their reader, for us, to know Jesus and to believe in Jesus. Next we have Acts, written by Luke, who wrote the detailed gospel account, the Doctor. Acts is a story of the gospel spreading like wildfire. The first part is full of amazing people who go out of their way to tell everyone about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Some of them even die for their announcement, for their proclamation of what Jesus has done for us. The second part focuses on a guy called Paul, who goes from killing Christians to making Christians because of an encounter with the living Jesus. He then travels to the known world at that time to tell people about the story of Jesus and his own story of how he came to follow Jesus Christ. It's an amazing story. Acts is a remarkable book and is packed full of action, and I love it, and I'm sure you will when you read it for the first time or for the 50th time. We then move on to Paul's letters. Letters to the early churches, these new churches that have emerged over the years since Jesus died and rose again. Some of these churches Paul establishes himself and writes to them, but others are planted as a result of his team going out and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ and calling people to follow him. These letters are written to encourage these new Christians and their churches in the fight and pursuit to live for Jesus and to pursue and engage in God's mission on earth. As well as encouragement, he also challenges, and there is a lot of challenge in these letters as these churches are trying to form and trying to work out who they are and what they're meant to be doing. And we see this in the letter to the Corinthians, where he addresses various problems such as jealousy, divisions within the church, sexual immorality. Much of these issues are similar issues that the church today experiences, and so these ancient letters are just as important for the church now as it was for the church back then. Romans has to be one of my favourites. It is rich and packed full of well thought through theology, basically our understanding of God and what Jesus has done for us. In this letter to the Christians in Rome, which is sent ahead of Paul's arrival to Rome, he writes of facts of the good news of Jesus Christ, basically the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. These facts include salvation, which is available to everyone, regardless of a person's identity, sin, or heritage. And this is underpinned by the most amazing truth that we are saved by grace, unearned, undeserved favour from God. We are saved by grace through faith, our complete trust in him, in Jesus Christ, and his finished work on the cross. We then move on to Paul's letters to certain individuals like Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. In the letter to Timothy, Paul encourages and passes on his wisdom to the young church leader. To Titus, Paul advises on his responsibility to supervise a number of churches on the island of Crete. And to Philemon, Paul tries to convince Philemon to forgive his runaway slave and accept him as a brother in the faith, essentially as equals, which was radical thinking for those times. We now move on to the general letters from Hebrews to Jude. Tom Wright, a leading theologian, calls these letters the early Christian letters. And Tom Wright writes this: "The early Christian letters are short, sharp, and to the point. They are full of clear, practical advice for Christians taking their early steps in the faith and needing to know where the problems were going to come and what resources they could find to cope with them." These letters deal with the dangers of Christian community and continues to share the amazing message of Jesus. They draw on ancient scriptures of Israel, the Hebrew Bible, to help young Christians find out who they really are within God's story of love and grace, and to find their purpose in him. Then we come to the final book of the Bible, Revelation, a book full of picture language. It's a tough book to get your head around, but it's one that reveals the full identity of Christ and also provides warning and hope to all those who believe in Jesus, all those who have said yes to following Jesus Christ, to living for him and for him alone. And this book ends with the hope that Jesus will return one day to complete God's mission. It says, "Yes, I am coming soon." It's a promise that Jesus will one day return to restore all things and judge the living and the dead. So that completes our whistle-stop tour of the New Testament. Before I finish this session with an attempted answer to that question, what is the Bible? We are now going to have a break, a pause for 5 minutes to reflect on the New Testament and begin to answer these two questions. What strikes you about the New Testament? And which book of the New Testament would you like to get your teeth into? So, what is the Bible? For me, it's not just 66 random books that speak of a time and a people long, long ago. It's not just a nice story to make us feel nice and feel happy. I believe, and many others believe, that there is a meta-narrative, a bigger story running throughout these 66 books. And that big story is the amazing, mind-blowing, awesome story of God who keeps on pursuing his creation, his people, you and me, despite our consistent rejection of him. It is a pursuit that ends with the death and resurrection of God's one and only Son, Jesus Christ, who calls us to follow him, to love him, and to tell others about him. And it's a story that will be fully completed when Jesus returns one day to judge the world and restore the world once and for all. That's what I believe the Bible is, and I hope you will discover, explore, and grow to love this story, be a part of this story, and say yes to Jesus. Thank you so much for joining me on this session of STB Bible Basics. I hope you'll join us next Sunday at 7:30 as we look at how can we trust the Bible. Can we actually trust it? But just a few resources to mention. If you like visualising the Bible, I highly recommend this brilliant book, The Infographic Bible. It's superb. For instance, there you go, there's a little highlight, the Noah's Ark. It's just full of great infographics to help us understand the Bible. And also, if you go on Google and type in the Bible Project, there are some brilliant resources there looking at each and every single book of the Bible, and again bring it to life so we can get to know the Bible a little bit better. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you can join us next Sunday at 7:30 for STB Bible Basics.